Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the webinar today on Managed Detection and Response, titled Who's Watching Your Network? I'm Mark Carl. I'm the CEO of Conexxus and the Vice Chair of the Data Security Standards Committee here at Conexxus, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. Our presenter today will be Tom Callahan, who's the Director of Operations for Managed Detection and Response for us here at ControlScan. Tom has about 15 years of experience in information technology, cloud computing, and cybersecurity. And we're happy to have Tom present today in this particular area of expertise, which is Managed Detection and Response, or MDR. And so just a quick run through the agenda we'll be going through today. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping as far as the webinar goes. We'll introduce the presenters, and then we'll talk a little bit about Conexxus, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. And after the presentation, we hope to have quite a bit of time left at the end to address some questions and answers. Next slide. All right, so housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. It'll be available on YouTube and through the website link at conexxus.org. For the slide deck, a survey link will go out after the presentation. And if you fill out that short survey, you'll get a link at the end to download the presentation. And for the participants that are joining us today, a reminder, if you're going to ask questions, put those into the chat box of the webinar. And then once we get to the Q&A section, we'll go back and review those and answer any of those questions that we feel are appropriate. And please no vendor-specific questions in the questions, please. Next slide. All right, so again, I'm Mark Carl, Vice Chair of the Data Security Committee, and I'm the moderator today. And we have with us speaking Tom Callahan, who's the Director of Operations of Managed Detection and Response at ControlScan. Our hosts today are Ali Russell and Jenny Bullard from Conexxus. Next slide. A little bit about Conexxus. If you're not familiar, we are an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. We help set standards for data exchange, security, and mobile commerce, amongst other things. And we provide vision in identifying emerging technology and trends that are coming to the market. And then additionally, we advocate for our petroleum and convenience store industry around other industries and other experts. Next slide. A quick rundown of the current webinar schedule for the next few months. Today we have Managed Detection and Response. In February, we're scheduled to have PCI DSS for petroleum merchants by Elizabeth Terry from the PCI Council. In March, protecting your stores and headquarters and main stores from data security and ransomware attacks from Acumera. In April, Don't Get Phished, train your employees to avoid ransomware with Jeffrey Vaughn and Ed Adams from Security Innovation. And then in May, we have firewall compliance, the basics, the benefits, and the security. That'll be presented by Simon Gamble from Mako Networks. Next slide. And I want to remind everyone that the Conexxus Annual Conference is coming up at the Lowe's Vanderbilt Hotel in Nashville, April 28th to May 2nd. We hope to see a lot of you there. If you're members of Conexxus, if you're not members, please reach out to any of us if you'd like more information. Next slide. All right, a little bit about what we're talking about today. Tom handles Managed Detection and Response for a number of different industries, one of which is the petroleum and convenience store industry. So Tom's going to walk us through, in general, what MDR is, why it's important, and why we particularly need it. After that, Tom's going to show us some examples and screenshots of how it actually works. And for those examples, we're using some logs that we ingest from a popular convenience store EPS or payment controller, which drives the credit card terminals both inside the store and at the automated fuel dispenser. And so our goal was to provide some real-world examples of how MDR is implemented within convenience store environments today to make it both informative and educational for the specific audience that we have here today. And with that, I will hand it over to Tom.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to start off with just going through, taking a look back at 2018 and looking at what that threat landscape looked like. So there were 53,000 reported security incidents that occurred in 2018. 2,200 reported data breaches. 70% of those breaches took longer than 3 months to discover within customer or corporate environments. 90% of those retail breaches were through point of sale systems. So that's very relevant to what we're going to talk through today. And 20% of all breaches total started through email phishing. So, these are stats that are released by, in this case, Verizon as part of their data breach investigations report, and just give a very high-level overview into what last year looked like. So back in 2018, there were some studies done around the average cost of a breach in the U.S., and that came out to $7.91 million. So when you break all that down, the metric that's really important to remember as we go through this today is it was $148 per data record involved in the breach. So phishing, on the previous slide you saw, phishing is the #1 entry mechanism to an organization. So on average, it's 16 minutes to the first click when a phishing campaign is delivered to your company. That means you've got 16 minutes from that first email showing up to a possible breach into your systems, credential theft, or the launch of malware into your networks. The good news is that only 4% of people will click and submit those credentials or download the malware, which is down from recent years. However, it still only takes one person to cripple your systems. 49% of that malware is delivered through email, with ransomware being the #1 payload, which, when deployed, it's quickly decimating companies through file encryption. It's taking out entire stores, entire backend systems, and just wreaks havoc. So the biggest challenge you have here is that unpatched systems and older systems, once they are breached and once they have malware or ransomware deployed, they lead to quick lateral movement, which is basically movement from the system that's initially infected to other systems throughout your network, and possibly from store to store, depending on how your connectivity is set up. 90% of retail breaches, as we talked about a little earlier, started at the point of sale system. The controllers, the terminals, the pin pads, all those pieces are very high targets due to the data that flows through those devices. So research done through these reports has shown that you're 100 times more likely to be targeted if you have a point of sale system. And the reason behind that is point of sale systems are traditionally weak and easy to exploit. They're often running on older or unpatched systems, and a lot of times on even unsupported operating systems. So even if they're patched or are running on newer versions of operating systems, a lot of times they're not fully up to date because of the risk involved in what a patch could do to a storefront or any of the backend systems. They often contain default or easily guessable passwords. So it is a well-known fact that a lot of the point of sale systems have default passwords. And if you're not changing those in your environment, then you lead to a very easy method of breaching in. And those are privileged accounts 9 times out of 10. So external access for reporting without protections creates a major security hole. Everybody wants to be able to get to this data at each of these individual stores. And the most traditional way you see that being done is holes are created in firewalls to allow access. Those holes are not properly protected. And this creates an entry point for malicious actors to get into those systems. Those systems by themselves are huge data sources. You could have hundreds of thousands of credit cards or other type of corporate data flowing through them on a day-to-day basis. Now, I remind back to the $148 per data record. So if you've got hundreds of thousands of cards or various other corporate data going through here, think about what that cost adds up to at $148 per data record on average. That number skyrockets pretty quickly. There's a significant lack of breach detection within the retail and point of sale markets. So most detections that are occurring are through a common point of purchase, notifying you, or law enforcement notifying you. Most retail storefronts, and the organizations that support them, they never know that something happened until they receive that notification. And by that point, you've been in that system for quite a while. So coming out of the Verizon data breach report, there was a kind of a good quote that I wanted to bring into this, and that is protecting your good name comes down to 2 things, defense and response. So you should build defenses that are strong enough to send cyber criminals in the direction of an easier target, which means not you, but no defense is 100% effective. Should an attacker get through, you have to be prepared to respond quickly and effectively. And those are points that we're going to go through today. So a little bit about managed detection and response. So what we're going to start to answer today is, what is MDR? Why does your company or organization need MDR? And then what about all the other investments you've made in security tools, your security team? How does that play into this? And what are the, how do they play together? So what is managed detection? Managed detection and response, it's an all-encompassing cybersecurity service that's used to detect and respond to cyber attacks. It's traditionally performed by a 24/7 by 365 security operations team, and it's backed through intelligence consisting of global threat feeds, behavioral and pattern-based threat detection, and analyst-driven threat hunting. So how does it work? Agent-based collection, hundreds of millions of events every hour. So these agents are delivered into the network. They are collecting data from various systems and applications, firewalls, all kinds of network gear. They're bringing that data together, and they're parsing all of that data for correlation of threats across those multiple sources. From all of that data and that correlation, you now have the alerting that comes out of that, followed up by human analyst interpretation and review. So why is all of this valuable? So if you look at just kind of a standard deployment, you've got your broadband internet that's coming into your store. Could be Comcast, Verizon, one of those. You may have a cellular internet backup for when that broadband goes down and you still need to process your business. And then you've got behind that main firewall router that's kind of in the middle of the screen here, you've got your environment broken out into multiple pieces. So you've got the internal point of sale systems, your PIN pads, your payment terminals. You've got your back office. So traditionally, this is where you might have a reporting system or your management systems. You've got your outdoor point of sale, so any of your dispensers or other kinds of controllers. And then you've got access points. So you traditionally have wireless in your environment. So you may have a point of sale wireless network, and then you'll have a back office wireless network. So all this together, you've got a lot of data in your environment. You've got a lot of systems. So how do you figure out ways to protect that? And we'll talk about that as we go through this. So we'll go through a few scenarios just to kind of walk through how MDR plays into these different scenarios. So in this particular scenario, looking at a point of sale vendor support are connecting in from a remote source to your systems. So how do you know it was actually them? How are you monitoring the activity? How do you know what they did while they were logged in? And how do you verify that they did what you expected them to do, that they haven't left holes open, things like that? And then how do you separate any of that from malicious activity versus support activity? So these are some raw log files. These are real life examples. So if you look at the first line here, we're able to identify and take all of that data that's in these lines and turn it into actionable information. So the bullet points I have below, through this data set, I'm able to track the remote access activity based on the VPN ID. So that's the yellow highlighted piece. So I can track that VPN connection from the birth of the connection, which is the first line, to when the actual connection was established and the communication began, which is the second line, to the point that they actually disconnected and terminated that VPN connection, which is the third line. We can identify the source IP of that VPN request. So where did they came from? Was this an IP address that I expect? All that kind of stuff. And that's the 199.71 you see there. We can identify through that second line the connection was successful or whether it failed. If this connection has failed, we can start a process of investigation if need be. We can identify, as I mentioned, when the connection is terminated, and then we can take all of this data and correlate it against the EPS and controller logs and any other system logs that are necessary. So I chose this example. If you look at the timestamps between the first three items, so in the first two, you've got a few seconds that occur between them. But then the third one is the termination of the VPN. So that termination of the VPN is a significant amount of time has transpired since the VPN connection came up to when it was actually torn down and deleted and the support team disconnected. So this particular example, while nothing high level looks malicious about it, you might be starting to question as to why for over 6 hours this connection was up and running. And this is the kind of stuff you can go back to the support team and say, hey, I just want to make sure and understand why you guys had this open. Or it could be indicative that they mistakenly left it open and then somebody saw it later on 6 hours later. So this is the kind of stuff you need to know to protect your stores and your infrastructure. So another piece of this is going to be a payment controller attempting a remote connection. So in this situation, we need to be able to detect that remote connection, whether it be inbound or outbound. We need to be able to investigate based on that data and then respond if necessary. So quick detection and validation of whether that access occurred is incredibly important. We need to be able to correlate the who, the what, the why, the when, and the where based on the data that we have. And then we have to establish a response plan for action based on what we gain out of the investigation. So moving into some of this log data. So this is an EPS controller attempting a network connection inbound, outbound. So in this example, going through some of the bullet points here, I'm able to identify the classification of the severity based on what the system's already predefined for me. So I know that this is flagged as a low severity, which is great. The system may think it's a low severity, but it's up to the analyst to honestly determine whether that's true or not. We're given the source IP address, which is the SRC equals in the top right. We're given the destination IP address, which is in the middle left, the DST equals. We're given the protocol of the traffic, which is in the middle of the second line there, proto equals TCP. And then we're given the destination port through that DPT line, which is 22. Now, as an analyst, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, this is SSH traffic, and SSH is an application that is used for remote command line access to a system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and determine what happened, why it happened, and correlate this against any VPN that occurred from a support team, and et cetera. So this then allows us to identify that activity, to alert, investigate, and then correlate it against those other data sets. And we can use that to determine whether the traffic was expected as part of that, maybe that support VPN, or whether it's unknown or unexpected traffic that could be malicious in nature. From that point, we're then able to establish a response plan, whether that be to block this system, block its outbound or inbound access, and then begin remediation as need be. So this is a screenshot of what that would look like, in one of our platforms. So you're seeing the highlighted piece there is we detected some network access, and we've now escalated that out to our analyst team because it hit certain thresholds. The analysts are taking a look on the left-hand side here in that diagram. They're getting a copy of the full log file. They're also getting a copy of all the fields broken out so that they can then take those fields and again correlate that and compare it and tie together logs from other systems based on some of those fields. So we're able to say, okay, I see in this one that the source IP was 8.4.5.8, and I'm going to take that and look for any other activity that tied back to maybe that IP address or any of the ports associated with this. Once they've made their analysis and are going any further, the picture on the right is how that analyst is then going to add comments to this event and then determine whether it needs to be escalated or we need additional information or whatever needs to happen through this system. So moving into our next scenario, we've got a vendor or partner access in the system. So again, we follow the very standard process. We're detecting it, we're investigating, and then we're responding. What actions were taken and were any changes made? So the first example we have on the top here, we've got a login via SSH like we talked about before. So this is command line access from a remote system to an internal system. It was not done through username and password. It instead used what's called a public key. So that public key is used as a replacement for username and password, and it's traditionally a very long string of characters that both systems have been told to trust. We see through the first line, we've got CentOS, which was the username, and then we've got the second yellow highlight, the 12.190 is the IP address that connected into this system. We can see that that session was established to that second line, so now the user not only has made the request for the connection, but they've actually opened the connection and they're in the system. And then we can see activity from that connection escalating their privileges to root, which is a much even higher privileged account than maybe the CentOS account was. So these kinds of activities could be indicative of normal maintenance activity or things like that, But anytime you see a privilege escalation, you really want to know why that's happening. And you want to make sure that that isn't malicious in nature, that somebody hasn't gained a copy of that public key and they're now accessing your system without permission, basically. So in the second example, I've got a very similar scenario where I've got root now going into the Joe user account and running on the second line here this backup setting script. So again, this could be maintenance activity. It could be non-maintenance activity. It could be somebody who's attempting to implement some kind of a rootkit or other type of malicious program into the system. So not only can we determine and see when users are logging in and logging out of the system, but we're able to track and understand what commands they're running so that we can trace back a communication from the POS support vendor all the way through the life cycle and know when they connected, where they connected from, what commands were run, and when they disconnected. So it gives us a really good picture of what happened. And this is important in that response component because the only way that you can respond effectively, and I go back to the effectively part of this, is to know what happened. So you can very quickly remediate instead of having to go through this massive forensic operation. So a third scenario we go to is around failures. So vendor or partner is attempting access to the system again. We follow our same traditional detect, investigate, and respond. And then we start to see failures. So these could be mistyped passwords, or it could be a password spray attack. So a password spray attack is very commonly where an attacker will come in. They will have a preset list of maybe 20 or 30 passwords, well-known default passwords, things like that. And they're going to use those and attempt multiple accounts across your network to see if they can match an account with one of those passwords. So from an alerting standpoint, we're not going to necessarily alert on a single failure because people make mistakes. You mistype passwords all the time, things like that. You may have your caps lock key on. But once it goes beyond one, we might start escalating the priority of that kind of event and eventually going into an alerting mode. So, multiple password failures might indicate that somebody's trying to do that brute force or that password spray attack. And that's the point where we start getting alerted and our analysts begin to look. So here's an example of just a single failure. So within this entire line item here, I've got the date and time. I've got the source to login. So on the top right-hand yellow block there, it was through SSH again. It was an authentication failure starting at that second line. So was it a success? Was it a failure, et cetera? I'm able to see what the host was. So that's the our host equals. So where they came from. And then I'm able to identify the attempted login user. So this particular example, they were trying to log in as root, and they either had a bad password or something to that effect. So based on this activity we see, again, it could just be a bad password mistyped, or it could be another scenario that's not malicious, but we continuously monitor these types of activities. And if they become recurring or they hit certain thresholds that we define, we can alert and develop the response plan for remediation. And that, again, going back into a remediation example for something like this, if we're seeing a lot of these from the same remote IP address and we don't expect that traffic, we can go to the firewall, we can go to any of the security devices and start blocking that at the source so it never even gets into the system. So there's a lot of different options you have from that response standpoint. So this is an example, again, within our existing platform of how that comes in and what the analysts are looking at. So they're getting, again, that full copy of that message. So if they need to dig deeper, they can. But it's also broken out into multiple fields. So this particular example, the user was bad guy. So you're looking at, I know where it came from. I know the severity. I know the user. I know a lot of attributes about this, then I can then compare to all the other log data. So I can say, all right, our host was 1032.17.50. I can look at various other systems throughout my network. Did I see attempts to any other system from that IP address as well? Is it just this system that I'm worried about, or is it multiple systems I have to be worried about? So beyond some of these examples, there's a lot of other logs and security data. So we've already talked a little bit about VPN access to to the point of sale systems, but you also may have other systems in your network. So it's tracking and monitoring the VPN access to those systems as well. It's monitoring and understanding system updates or activities. So are patches being applied to systems correctly? Are there malicious updates that could possibly be coming in from third-party sources? Is there software being installed that shouldn't be? All those kinds of pieces. Firewall modifications. So if somebody mistakenly opens up a port and instead of restricting it to a certain source IP, they don't restrict it, and now I've got this open to everybody, we can track that and we can understand and say, hey, this may not have been the best idea. I think you've opened up a security hole, and we need to develop a plan to remediate that. So all of this is actionable data, and again, with the right correlation and the right intelligence behind the screen, these are all actionable data sets. So some questions as an organization for people to ask. So how much data do I really have? So in what we've kind of laid out here is an organization with 50 employees. They're going to have some network equipment, so an internet router. They're going to have some firewalls, desktop laptops, and some POS terminals. They're likely going to have wireless, which means they're going to have access points, maybe inside and outside, depending on what type of retail or store location this is. They're going to have devices, so security cameras, things like that are considered IoT or Internet of Things devices. Pump monitoring systems, outdoor point of sale, pin pads, things like that. So with an organization of this size, you're looking at an average of 750 to 1,000 logs per second. Now, accounting for any kind of variance while that store or that location might be closed, that's 50 million logs per day. So how are you monitoring that much data? And how are you taking, even if you are monitoring that much data, how are you actually using that data to determine whether you're secure or not? The next thing to ask is, how important is the data? This data that comes out of these systems, there's threats that appear consistently in these logs. So you've got invalid network traffic, you've got authentication failures, you've got user access or account modifications, administrators going in and modifying other user accounts, things like that. And if you're on a commodity internet, such as a Comcast or a Verizon or one of these, they are subject to constant attack. So that invalid network traffic is a very, very real thing. Threat actors will breach one system, and then they just move laterally across that network, as we talked about a little bit before. The logs can detect this activity. They can notify of a security event, and then through that real-time monitoring, you're identifying that activity in minutes or hours instead of days or months. Going back to the first slide, the average time of identifying a breach was 3 to 6 months, and that's just too long. So with this next slide, we're going to go through just at a high level what an attack really looks like within an environment, and I'll play this into some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So the first step for any attacker, whether it be a targeted attack or a non-targeted attack, is that reconnaissance. So they're going to start harvesting information. They're going to look at what they can figure out from outside your network. They're going to look at who works at your organization. This is where a lot of the phishing pieces come in. And then they're going to develop a strategy as to how they're going to go about attempting to get into your network or go after social engineering and other types of pieces. So this is where that social engineering comes in. They're going to look at any kind of info on previously stolen credentials or possibly previous breach data that may be out there. So every breach that occurs, that breach becomes typically available on the quote-unquote dark web, and it can be identified, picked up, and it can be used by these attackers to look for your email address or your company or your employee names, and they'll try those to see if password reuse is occurring. So through that recon, they're going to be looking for open ports. They're going to look for anything that's publicly facing to the internet, and they're going to be searching for any kind of vulnerable websites or assets. So huge example of this is the EPS itself that has a web server on it. Somebody may have opened that up, and this happens more than we care to see, but somebody may have opened that up and exposed some of that journal data so that from remote locations, they can pull in that data and do any kind of reporting or review the sales data for that site. So that's a very small hole that creates a very, very big problem if not properly secured. And these are the kinds of things that they're looking for. There's a lot of websites available to do this very easily. Shodan is one of them, and it's probably one of the most well-known. And basically, Shodan is just a giant database of pre-scanned data. So I can go in and I can type in maybe through that reconnaissance, I figured out your external IP. I can go in and see what exists on Shodan for that, and I might be able to find that this is the system you're running, and this is how long it's been online, and various other attributes. So from that piece, they're going to take those actions, do social engineering, identify a method in, and then once they get in, they're going to establish that foothold. They're going to set up communications, what's called persistence, back to wherever they are. So that in the event that you decide like, oh, well, this machine's acting weird, I'm going to restart it. When it restarts, it recreates that connection and they're back in. From that point, they're going to go through and take some additional actions. So they may create more reverse shells. Reverse shell being basically a terminal back to themselves. They may set up command and control traffic, which is typically what you'd see in like a botnet or similar type of scenario. I talked through the persistent backdoor. And then the escalation. So they're going to see if through that user that they've used to get into the network, whether that user has additional permission capabilities. So can I use that user to get into a higher privileged account? What does that user have access to? How do I move from here into that whole lateral movement component, which is where they go into that discovery phase. So the goal of discovery is to figure out what's in your network. Where are the databases? What kind of systems are you running? How do I get to that data? So they're scanning the network. They're using tools like Responder, and they're looking at files available. They're looking at any kind of file servers. They're looking for things like files that have the word pass or secret or any kinds of things like that that are very quick to search, but may contain a lot of data that they can then use to go further into the environment. And then they're going to continue to spread themselves throughout your network. So this is that lateral movement again. They're going to spread their foothold. They're going to get access to multiple systems. So if you determine that this particular system that they've already breached, and you take it offline and you completely format it or do something to that effect, that they still have other footholds throughout your network, with the end goal of basically getting the keys to the kingdom. So they want to have the absolute most privileged access. They want to have access to all of the secrets that you have inside the network, and they want to be able to use that to get and exfiltrate data that's valuable to them. And that's their, those are their objectives. So every one of these steps, the absolute goal is to figure out what they want to get, what's in your environment that's valuable to them, to extract that data or that access, and to use it in their favor. So what about response? We've talked a lot about detection. We've talked a little bit about what the response component looks like, but how does response actually work? So analysts are there to provide the immediate action plans to actively block or prevent that malicious activity. Their goal is to quarantine a host or a system from the network if necessary, to block that network traffic through firewall rules and monitoring, and to remediate the threat to get the systems back online quickly but securely. They also work to triage with any kind of internal teams or any incident response teams necessary to provide a larger scale response plan and activities. So going into, great, I understand a little bit about MDR. I understand why I need it. I understand how it works. So why does my company need it? What about all the other stuff that we've already been doing for, the past year, a couple of years? So the investments in tools and security products that you probably already have today, it's not enough. Are you watching and taking action on alerts from your security systems? So you may have put in endpoint, you may have put in firewalls and network access control and various other pieces inside your network, but who's handling those? Who's watching them? Who's keeping them updated? Who's taking action very specifically when these kinds of threats alert in there? Is somebody looking at it on a weekly basis? Is somebody looking at it on a monthly basis? How are you handling that internally? And is it really a value add for you to be really handling that internally? Companies, organizations are under constant attack. Most of the results are drive-by attacks. So targeted attacks are a whole different, kind of attack. But a lot of times you're just caught in the crossfire, depending on who your internet or network provider is. The other ones I've talked about are the targeted attacks. So those are designed specifically for your network employees, and those are really tough, to go through. The average detection time for a breach, as we talked about earlier, it's over 6 months. Can you really wait that long to find out that malicious actors are in your network stealing your data? We talked about, possibly hundreds of thousands of cards or other corporate data that's flowing through your network on a daily basis. Now, with $148 per data record, extrapolated to how many data records generated per day, and then break that over 6 months. That number is scary, and that number is very real, and you don't want to have to deal with it. On top of all of this, you've got regulators and compliance that are getting even more strict. So can you afford the cost of a breach or a business outage? Even with the insurance, how are you structured as an organization within your risk to handle this kind of a situation? So what about other existing tools? You've bought firewalls, you've bought the IDS and IPS. Do we still need them? And the answer is yes, 100 times yes, absolutely. They are your first lines of defense and detection. And if you don't have firewalls and those kinds of devices, the average breach time of a Windows or similar desktop on a publicly exposed network without any protection is minutes, not hours, not seconds, not weeks. It happens very, very fast. So these firewalls and other devices, they are your first lines of defense, and they are required to be there. But you have to keep them patched. You have to keep them updated, and you have to keep them monitored. What about antivirus, anti-malware? Pick a 3 or 4 letter acronym, depending on the day. So all of these are necessary to have. But you get, again, into you can't just deploy it and then let it sit there. Who's updating the policies? Who's responding and mitigating to the alerts that come out of these systems? How are you taking and correlating this data to ensure that, okay, I got an alert on desktop A, but how do you know that desktop B didn't get infected as well and it's just sitting there dormant, or C or D? How do you know that that didn't incur lateral movement, and while you're repairing desktop A, that there's other stuff going on in your network at the same time? So other types of tools, you've got your SIM tools, which are great in theory. They're collecting all your data, and that's fantastic. But I bring it back again to who's monitoring. Do you have a dedicated team who's looking at this data, who's taking action on this data? And application whitelisting, absolutely fantastic. But I'm sure that somebody is tuning this daily and weekly because your applications never change, right? These are things that they're all great in practice, but the problem most companies run into is they can implement them and they get the project and everything gets approved. They put them in place, but then they never touch them again. And in reality, they're actually more dangerous in a stagnant state than not having it at all. So is MDR the silver bullet? It's not. That's far from reality. MDR is another component as part of the corporate cybersecurity program. So it provides a mechanism to keep your eyes on the prize and to keep that prize in your hands instead of somebody else's. You still need IT controls, you still need risk assessment, and you still need DevSecOps. So system and application monitoring and patching. You need to be looking at your applications, you need to be looking at your desktops, laptops, et cetera, your point of sale systems. They need to be monitored, they need to be patched. Patches exist for a reason, and they're there to provide the security protection necessary. You need security policies on how you're handling desktops and mobile devices and any bring your own device and your servers and your point of sale and the multitude of IoT devices and stuff that are showing up day in and day out. You need ongoing risk assessment integrated with your operations and finance teams to understand what your risk profile is, what your how much risk you can handle, and how you're investing towards that. And then you need DevSecOps, which is the integration of development. And not only IT development, this is business development, this is product development, various other types of development, but you need an integration between your development, your security teams, and your operations. So everybody's on the same page, nobody's operating in a silo, and that when it comes to making sure that you are secure, that is your organization, your company is changing, you're opening new stores, things like that, that you're doing it in a secure manner, and you feel that you have a good amount of control over it. And you need a plan. You need a documented plan, one that's reviewed often as a company and not as an individual. If you've got an IT group and they're the only ones that know about the plan and they're the only ones that are creating the plan solely for the purpose of the auditor, that's not a plan. That's a compliance document. To have a full, true cybersecurity program, it needs to be from the top down within your organization. So A lot of information. I wanted to kind of open it up to some questions based on what we've talked about today. And I will take any of the questions and work through it, and we'll see where we go.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tom. Appreciate it. It was very informative. Here's a couple of questions. So, what are the particular technologies within MDR that would help in protecting a back office PC from ransomware?
So typically when you're looking at any of the PCs or whether they really be front office or back office, the first thing you're going to want to look at is, a antivirus and anti-malware. So your traditional endpoint, the market's starting to call it EDR at this point, but you're looking at technology that is able to identify both pattern-based and known threats, as well as to identify the newer behavioral style. So a lot of these newer products are able to identify new threats as they appear, not by waiting for an update from when somebody somewhere else saw it, but able to actually monitor and see how a program or a person is behaving on that system, and then flagging that activity based off that behavior. So that's a huge first starting point. And then from that point, you're looking at, again, that logging, being able to collect that and integrating that into a central detection and response system.
Great. All right, next question. We hear a lot of acronyms like UTM, MSP, MSSP, and MDR. Are they all similar or the same, or what is the difference?
So a lot of them are similar in some of their core functions, but where you separate, your MSP or your MSSP from an MDR style service, you're getting into MDR is more designed around being able to identify it quickly, to correlate it, and then to develop response. So it's not simply the detection, it's the actual response component as well. So an MSSP or a traditional MSP is more of a detection-based system, and then they may alert out to some other team and things like that, but they're not taking an active response role. Where MDR really separates itself is that active response component, and being able to not only notify a team that there's an issue, but to actively block it and start taking steps immediately to prevent any further damage or spread within the network.
Great. Thanks. So another question just came in here. Are you correlating the info from the customer's current tools, or do you recommend a tool set to deploy for monitoring?
So we correlate from anything that we can get our hands on. The way a lot of your MDR systems are designed is to be able to take log data not only from your traditional systems like your Windows machines and their event logs, or your Linux or other machines and their kind of event logs, but also to be pulling from your network devices, to be able to pull in from any cloud systems that you have. So that's kind of the big next piece that a lot of companies are going after, is as you're moving some of your systems out into more cloud-based environments. Office 365 is a great example of this. You're losing that on-premise capability of collecting data. So as an MDR, what we develop is the ability to maintain capturing that data and make sure that we are still able to see that information and correlate it across. So we collect everything to answer that question.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that myself, having done some of the work on some of the examples we gave. So in the convenience store industry in particular, there are obviously some very popular EPSs and terminals and AFDs that are very common to the industry. And so what that gives us the ability to do is to be able to look for certain things that are very unique to those particular environments. And that helps us a lot in some of the examples that the screenshots that we put in today. So we know, when we go in and there's a particular POS vendor in EPS and a particular set of technology, what those logs are already going to look like. So we can ingest those and go ahead and monitor and alert on them very quickly. At the same time, every environment is unique. It doesn't matter what industry it is. So there's other things to do on back office PCs and firewalls as far as sending those logs and those types of things that have to be done. But this particular industry gives us the ability to at least do a little bit of cookie cutter.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
good point.
That was the last question that we had. So no one else has any other questions, then we will finish up for the day. We appreciate everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, then feel free to follow up.